teachers and students and anybody else out there who's interested in the Constitution and American politics. We are the 4 Bs, and tonight is our last segment for this portion or this period of our program. We are on our 12th episode dealing with the national questions in the We the People program. And those of you who either don't know or aren't interested in We the People, what's great about it, it allows us to talk about topics that are, I think, very important and very insightful for just the average citizen there. And so tonight we're going to be talking about foreign policy, Eisenhower's Farewell Address and the military-industrial complex, and its relationship in some form, I guess, to the American Constitution here. And with us tonight is another Badger, which means that the Bulldogs are now in a minority against the Badgers, and that is Professor David Fields. He is the associate director of the Center for East Asia Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He earned his PhD in history at the University of Wisconsin, specializing in U.S.-Korean relations. He is the author of Foreign Friends, Sigmund Rhee, American Exceptionalism, and the Division of Korea. That's a whole nother conversation he and I will have later on. And before he finished his PhD, he also worked at the Center for the Study of the American Constitution as a documentary editor. So he's got a rather wide range of experiences and insights, and we're very happy to have Professor Fields with us tonight. So the first, I kind of want to start out general and kind of start out with a historical basis. And so Professor Fields, I'm going to, kind of start with you, but this is also an area that I imagine Professor Moore has some thoughts about, as well as Mr. Williams and Mr. Kavanaugh. So what does the Constitution and the ratification debates tell us about the framers' view of both a national military and foreign policy? That is, if you look at the words of the Constitution, or you look at the ratification, what does that communicate to us about the 18th century view of the military and foreign policy? Professor Fields, do you have any thoughts, insights on that?
I do, and I would like to start out by just thanking you for inviting me to come on and address you. I love the We the People program. When I worked at CSAC and even a little bit after, I regularly volunteered for the We the People program as a state judge. I judged once at the national level. It's such a wonderful civic education program that I wish I could have been a part of when I was a student. I hope someday my kids will be able to be a part of it. Civic education is just, I think it's essential to, a functional democracy, a democracy where we can meet difficult challenges and make wise decisions. It's hard to do that if people don't understand the way the government actually works and the framework that it was written in and how it's adapted over time. So I love this program, and I'm just grateful to be a part of it whenever I get the opportunity. I will also say that I'm a specialist in modern U.S.-Korean relations. So when I'm speaking about modern U.S.-Korean relations, I really am an expert. When I'm talking about foreign policy in general over American history, I'm just happy to engage in a conversation with all of you who I think probably know about as much as I do about it. So I'm an expert on U.S.-Korean relations, but I love talking about all sorts of things. All right, so with that caveat, I'll get back to your question. And two things come to mind. And one, I think, as the founders are drawing up the Constitution and throughout the ratification debates, I think it's important to understand that they have very much a domestic focus on what's going on. And rather than seeing foreign policy as a great opportunity for the United States, I think they see foreign policy as a potential threat to the United States. I think they recognize that the challenges of the founding period of just getting the Constitution ratified, of looking out from the eastern seaboard and looking west and seeing that there is this huge, massive chunk of territory there that could be, could make up future states in what is a United States, or it could be, Spanish possessions. It could be British possessions. It could be someone else's possessions. And I think that's really where their focus was. How do you consolidate the Union? How do you come up with a workable frame of government? How do you plan for American expansion, which I think was directly on their minds? and how do you limit foreign policy entanglements that might make that more complicated? So, I think that's what lies behind something like, Washington's Farewell Address, which often is interpreted by some Americans as, a statement of American isolationism. And I don't think that's ever what it was intended to be. I think it was someone looking out at the world from that particular moment in American history and saying, we don't want to get involved. We don't want to be sucked into European conflicts because we got plenty on the table for us to deal with right now. And I think that you can see over the progression of American history that after the Civil War, and you have that later period of the 19th century where really the republic is consolidating, you're getting a stronger federal government. And that's why it takes until the 20th century for American policymakers to really turn to foreign affairs as a major opportunity for the United States, and where foreign affairs really come to, I won't say dominate, because I think domestic affairs still dominate American politics, but it really comes to play a much larger role in the 20th century than it did in the 19th century. Go ahead.
No,
Tim.
go ahead, Dave. Go ahead, David.
Oh, and just your other thought on their fears about a standing army. I think that the main thing that they were afraid about with a standing army is that it would be very, very expensive, and that it would serve no direct purpose. And in the first case, I think they were right. A standing army of the size that the United States maintains is terrifically expensive. I mean, it's horrendously expensive. And the United States spends more on defense than the next 10 countries combined. And we're not talking about little countries. We're talking about the next 10, including China, Russia, France. I just looked it up. It's $730 billion. It's 15% of all discretionary spending. All right, that is a lot of money. And I think that in one sense is exactly what they were afraid would happen. I think they were also afraid that it would have no peacetime domestic use. Now, in that sense, I'm not so sure that they were right as American foreign policy and really as international politics has come to develop. And one of the ways that I like to think about the American military presence abroad, especially in Europe and in East Asia, is American commitments in those regions actually stabilizing those regions and resulting really in unprecedented economic growth and really in wealth to the United States, either in terms of lower costs on goods that allow people to live at a higher standard of living while wages have stagnated, or just in terms of places for American investment, vehicles for American investment. So I think they were right about the cost of it, but as times have changed, as the world has gotten smaller, I think there actually is a use for a peacetime standing army.
I think I really appreciate David's comment on the founders and this notion of standing army not necessarily being even necessary. I mean, there was a tremendous sense of isolation in the two oceans separated from the world kind of thinking, and I think it did, to David's point, permeate their thinking about it being unnecessary. And but if you want to make an argument, they're always concerned about. The 1600s, English history in the 1600s is always in their mind. Standing armies, whether it's a parliament army or whether it's a king's army, they're always, and the anti-Federalists use that argument over and over and over again. But I think David's point's well taken on the isolationism really did factor into their notions of it being unnecessary. And additionally, navies were as big a deal, maybe even more concern, and that has a lot to do with their British experience. And they were as nervous with navies, maybe more so than standing army.
If I could just follow up on one thing too, is that when I read something like the Farewell Address, I really don't see that even interpreted quite literally, really as a statement of isolationism. And I'm of the opinion that outside of just a few fringe groups in the United States, a true isolationist movement has never existed. The struggle has been between unilateralism and multilateralism. All right. So should the United States maintain as much freedom of action as possible to maintain its own independent foreign policy? Or should we work together in close cooperation with other powers to try to achieve our foreign policy goals? Those people who actually, those people who wanted to cut the United States off from the rest of the world, say as Japan did in the late imperial period, or as Korea had tried to do at some point. Those people, frankly, do not really exist in the United States outside of a few fringe pockets, and they rarely ever gain any traction. I think really since the beginning, Americans have been interested in the rest of the world. They've been interested in trade. They've been interested in opportunities there. The question was, do we bind ourselves with other powers through alliances, or do we try to maintain an independent course of action as much as possible?
Well, I'd like to test you on that, Professor Fields, because I guess I'm a little bit unclear. First of all, I mean, we'll take three historic situations, and starting in the 1790s, and that is the Washington administration's challenge on the war between France and England. That doesn't seem to be about unilateralism or multilateralism. It does seem to be a lot about America's place in the world at the time. But I guess more recently or more contemporarily is, when you say that there's not really been an isolationist, and I would agree with you commercially, America's never been isolationist when it comes to, trade and commercial transactions. But this question implies a connection between military and foreign policy. How do you explain American attitudes pre-World War I and pre-World War II? It seems to be a strong state of opinion amongst the American people that those military conflicts, whether part of an alliance or whether by ourselves, is the United States has no business getting involved in that. So doesn't that kind of defy your statement that we don't have a true isolationist character within our society?
No, I don't. I actually don't think it does. And when you look at a decision like the Versailles Treaty, and the failure to ratify the Versailles Treaty, what you see is the real reason that treaty failed was deciding over how far the United States should go in binding itself unilaterally to the League of Nations. So as you probably know, an overwhelming majority of senators are in favor of it. They just cannot decide under what terms they will support it. And so there's the issue of reservations. You have the reservationists who are demanding certain reservations that will maintain American unilateralism. What's really interesting, though, and this is something that I discovered while I was writing this book, is that the irreconcilables, the people who are labeled as the arch unilateralists, actually become the champions of the Korean independence movement. And you can read chapter 3 in my book, which is the speeches that all the irreconcilables give on Korea during the debate over the Versailles Treaty. And their argument is that we made a mistake when we did not stand up for Korean independence and tacitly supported the Japanese occupation of Korea. Now, if we ratify the Versailles Treaty and Japan is a part of the executive council of that league, there's no way we can go back and undo that mistake that we've made. We will be binding ourselves forever to recognize this. And it wasn't just Korea that they brought up. They were actually fishing around for all sorts of international issues, exactly because they did not want to be labeled as isolationists. They hated that term isolationist, and they did not believe that it was true of themselves, which is why they much preferred the term the irreconcilables. So it's interesting to see that the arguments that they're making against the Versailles Treaty are not arguments that the United States should cut itself off from the world. They're actually arguments that said the United States has a moral responsibility to act in certain situations in certain ways, and we cannot cede that moral responsibility to a supranational international body that will tell us how to react. And I think that's what you see in a lot of these debates. Is it in the United States' interest to get involved here or not? But the overarching motivation is never to cut the United States off. Okay, it's always interested in engagement.
Well, and again, I agree with you. But you went to the tail end of World War I, which by 1918 it's established that Wilson's established we're fighting for democracy. We're fighting to make the world safe for democracy. Yeah. There's an internationalist component to Wilson's motivation to get into the conflict in the first place. But if we go pre-1917, if we go to the election of 1916, it's clearly an articulation. And I don't like the word isolationist, at any point in American history. I think it's more, non-interventionist, or non-militaristic kind of solutions that we're looking at. Because like I said, I think, commercially, we're always looking for ways, to interact with the rest of the world. And then if we look at, again, the early and mid 30s, the American character is clearly, it doesn't matter whether it's multilateral or international or unilateral. America is clearly, we want nothing to do with that place over there, kind of thing. So,
some, Dave, some, not, I mean, there's the America First movement, right? And you go back.
Well, how do you, Chris,
I'm trying to avoid the broad brush here. So I'm just, Wilson's, one of his slogans was he kept us out of war. So he gets reelected and then we get in war. So that's convenient. But I'm just trying to avoid the broad brush. I think I'm not disagreeing with you. I do believe there were with the America First movement that we saw in the 30s in the lead up to the World War II, that, we call them in textbooks isolationists because they don't want to get involved in that. So I think there are pockets of it, but I don't know that there was a broad swath of Americans that were.
David, is it fair to say that our interests, I like this idea of nobody's an isolationist, but what I kind of hear you say between the lines is we kind of pick and choose the terms of our engagement. So is it fair to say that some, like if it's human rights, we'll go cooperative or unilateral. When it comes to economic interests, will be collective or or unilateralist. I mean, how does I've heard it said that there's the human rights, there's economics, there's security. That's like a milk stool of foreign policy. Do we have a tendency to be more unilateral in one of those three legs and more collectivist in other of the three legs of foreign policy?
David Hendrickson wrote a wonderful book probably about 20 years ago, which he titled Union, Nation, or Empire, in which he talked about these three tendencies in American society that always exist side by side. And the union aspect, if you could translate it crudely into my terms, is the multilateralist aspect. And then the imperial aspect would be the more unilateral aspect. And then the nation aspect would be more those people who, and I don't really like the term isolationism, but who are really much more focused on domestic politics. All right. And he argues that those three strains run through American history and they're always there. It's just at certain moments, one of them is more dominant than the others. One will come to fore more than the others. And that could be, related to what's happening in a domestic political sense. It could be related to something external. The America First movement is so powerful until 7 December 1941. And then Charles Lindbergh is applying to join the U.S. Air Force. I'm sorry, the U.S. Army Air Corps. There is no Air Force at that time. But so I think these are tendencies that are always there. So I think that you really have to tease out at any particular moment, what the priority is. I think another aspect that often gave the United States in international focus that we overlook because it's not a factor today is actually the Christian missions movement. And for someone who studies the history of East Asia, when I got into it, it was remarkable how much Americans really cared about the foreign missions movement and how much they really believed that they could Christianize the world in a generation. And, the student volunteer movement of the early 20th centuries, it's just remarkable to think about the best and brightest coming from places like Harvard, Yale and Princeton, University of Pennsylvania, graduating and volunteering to be missionaries in places like China and Korea and Japan. And, the development of Christian missions in these regions really captured the American imagination for the first 20 years of that century. And that's another thing, along with economic and military interests. There are these cultural interests as well. And so I think in more modern times, this takes the shape of, say, human rights. I think that's a pretty similar correlate. That's obviously something that doesn't exist in that same language in the early 20th century. But I think Christian missions actually plays a similar role.
Professor Williams, you're bouncing a lot. Some insights here?
Yeah, no, this has been a wonderful 25 minutes. I hope the students are appreciating a couple ideas that have come out. I mean, the way Professor Fields framed it at the beginning in terms of a debate over a standing army, right? And the way you framed it, I heard you say like the founders were really thinking about, is a standing army, is it good for the common good? Like, is it effective? Like, is it worth our money? And is it necessary? And it strikes me how far we've come. Like, we don't have debates over a standing army, much less whether we should be spending 15% of our discretionary budget on the military we have. And just to give the students some perspective on this, $760 billion a year, it's a lot of money. Biden's infrastructure plan is going to be $2 trillion over 10 years. So over the next 10 years, we'll spend almost $8 trillion, probably with inflation, right? So it's a tremendous amount of money, and it just strikes me the lack of debate amongst citizens and elites over this very important concept of having a standing army. So that's what came to mind for me.
No one says, how are you going to pay for it? How are we going to pay for it? Yes.
Well, so to what extent, Tim, was there any specific anti-Federalist paper, because they're not as coordinated as the Federalists, is there any specific anti-Federalist argument or paper on?
I'm glad you asked that question, David. I would recommend Brutus 8, Brutus 9, and Brutus 10. And we'll put those in the video. I mean, they're really, and Brutus is a great writer. So if you want to get the anti-Federalist argument, and there's a lot of history in it, there is some of the expense argument too, and even there's this notion that the District of Columbia, the federal district, would be this haven of oppression where the standing army could hole up until they're unleashed like a plague on the land. And then the Federalist papers, I'd say that it's 24, 25, 40, 41, and 46. I would recommend to students being the go-to papers on this standing army. Now, remember, it's interesting. I looked this up. 7 of the states' ratification conventions, when they sent along their recommended amendments, 7 states recommended there being a statement in the Constitution that standing armies were, and sometimes it was ought not be, and sometimes the statement was prohibited. So there was tremendous. So it's not just the cranky anti-Federalist. Many of these recommendatory amendments were kind of plea bargained in their conventions. So 7, it was there. So they're now whether it's interesting because as David has said, what we think about now is precious little to the rhetoric that was expended at the founding about the standing army.
Well, to what extent is this related to the fundamental principles of liberty? I looked at Madison's speech in late June at Philadelphia. He seems to cloak it in, again, what I think partly what you referenced is 17th century history, but going back all the way to Rome.
Well,
go ahead.
Well, remember, there's also, are you ready, Mike?
Yeah.
There's a federalism component to this.
No way.
Yeah, shocking. I mean, you look at Article 1, Section 8. I think it's 12 through 16 are all the statements in Article 1, Section 8 about the military, standing army, militia. So there's this tremendous discussion about, is there still a role for localism, militia, and to what extent would the national government control the officer corps? Would they control the officer corps? Would that be the purvey of states. I mean, under the articles, the states were in charge of everything beneath the officer corps. There's also a tremendous fear of the Cincinnati, the Society Cincinnati. Would that be this elite corps of officers? So there's a federalism component to all these discussions about control of an armed military.
So let's, just because of time's sake, I want to move on to Eisenhower's farewell address. And given that Professor Fields is, his field is U.S. Korean relations, and again, we look at the Eisenhower administration. I mean, a heck of a lot of connectivity to your field of study there. But what is your understanding, David, to the context and the purpose of what Eisenhower says in 1961 as he's leaving office? That speech, what is your understanding of the context and the purpose?
I think he's recognizing, to put it tritely, that with great power comes great responsibility, and also with great power comes a great propensity to screw up in a big way. And that's what I think he's getting at when he says the potential for a disastrous rise in misplaced power. I think the truth is that, when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. And when you don't have a hammer, you're not interested in nails. And so one way you can think about this is the United States is actually really interested in East Asia in the late 19th, all the way through the early 20th century. I mean, there's the open door policy in China. We're actually very concerned with Japanese encroachment on the mainland in China, not in Korea, interestingly, but by the time they get into China, we are. But we don't get involved in that quite simply because we don't have the power to do so. And so there was the interest there. But quite frankly, everyone knew that we just did not have the ability to project power into East Asia. In fact, I was actually just reading this week about Theodore Roosevelt's dispatch of the Great White Fleet around the world. And part of the reason he wanted to do that was to see if it was even possible, to see if they could move the 14 ships of the Atlantic Squadron all the way around and to see how long it would take them to get to East Asia if they needed to. And actually, Congress gave him a lot of grief over that and said that they wouldn't appropriate money to do it. And he said, well, I'm going to dispatch them anyway. And if you want to leave them stranded in East Asia by not, appropriating money for coal to get them home, that's fine. But it's my prerogative as commander-in-chief to send them there. Anyway, but so because we don't have that capability, we actually stay uninvolved in a lot of conflicts. Now, was that good? Was that not good? Maybe things would have looked a little bit differently in World War II if we had been involved a little bit earlier, if we had been preparing to be involved a little bit earlier. But certainly it limited the number of conflicts the United States was involved in faraway places, prior to World War II. And I think what Eisenhower was seeing is, it's really after the Korean War. So after World War II, there's kind of a debate going on in American society. Do we return back to our pre-war norms? Do we return back to, so the U.S. has had a standing army for a long time, but it's really a puny standing army. And it was really more a professional officer corps that would just be the skeleton for a larger force if we ever actually got into trouble. And there was this debate going on between 1945 and 1950. Do we go back to what many called a traditional American state and a traditional American army? Well, the Korean War kind of answered that question. The Korean War and the new Cold War that results as a part of that. And I think Eisenhower was looking at the kind of capacity that had been built just since 1950 and saying, wow, we are in a really different category than we've ever been before. We have more power than we've ever had before. And we need to keep an eye on this. This could potentially be dangerous. And what's so interesting about that is Eisenhower is part of the chain of presidents that starts escalating, towards American involvement in Vietnam. So it's not that he didn't see that coming. I actually think that's one of the things that he sees coming and saying, wow, when we have the ability to be involved in almost any conflict because we have the power projection, how do we know where to draw the line? You know, where do we say that this is not in our interest to do it, even though we can? And I think that's what he was grappling with himself. And so while that speech is not a list of thou shalt nots, including thou shalt not do some of the things that I am doing right now, I think it's a testament to a sense of unease that he's having with, you know, seeing the directions that American foreign policy might go with these new capabilities.
Isn't it kind of a little bit like Dr. Frankenstein yelling, "Look out for the monster"? I mean,
I think that's exactly it. You know, I think he could see that a lot of this was unhealthy. And another thing that he points out in this speech that I think is so interesting is actually warning about the federalization of universities. You know, and it's during this time that really a lot of state universities, like this University of Wisconsin, are essentially becoming federalized. I mean, the portion of their budget that's coming from the federal government is starting to quickly outstrip, you know, the portion that they get for the state government. And that
are you referencing like investment, you know, federal investment in research and development for
Yes.
the Cold War scenario? Okay,
exactly all sorts of R&D, you know, and we think about it in terms of sciences, but it also happens in the humanities and the social sciences. In fact, I have a job today, and the University of Wisconsin has a Center for East Asian Studies because it's funded by the federal government. I'm not sure that the people of Wisconsin would actually put up the money to support a Center for East Asian Studies. And on the one hand, this is absolutely great because it means, you know, you can be a hick from the woods of Wisconsin like me. And if you want to study Korean at the University of Wisconsin, you can do that, you know, so we don't have all of our experts coming from just a few select schools in California. But at the same time, someone might ask, does the state of Wisconsin actually need someone who is an expert in Korean politics?
Do Koreans have something similar to a brat? Is that the reason that Wisconsin there, you know, has that
cheese curds?
Yeah, put kimchi on it. Kimchi broth.
Professor Williams, I'm curious from a political science point of view, what you know, and again, Chris, I really loved it because I had for years talked about this speech and the hypocrisy of Eisenhower and Frankenstein's that analogy of, you know, he built the monster and then he's warning about it at the end as he goes off in the sunset. But I read a couple of interesting, you know, sources that he was concerned about it from 1953 on. He just chose to not publicly say things there, you know, for various political reasons and things. So I'm starting to rethink whether or not he is indeed Dr. Frankenstein. But what is the danger of this complex, this military-industrial complex?
Well, I think were you talking to me or Mike?
You, both of you, actually.
Okay. Well, I think the more we know about Eisenhower, the more he really kept his cards close to his vest. He, you know, people thought of him, oh, he's playing golf all the time. He's hitting this pine tree at Augusta. But he was much more hands-on, I think, as we find out about what was going on there. And, you know, as a military guy, which he was, you know, the West Point guy from Kansas, he wanted to be hands-on during this time frame. So I don't necessarily, it's kind of like Dr. Frankenstein, that kind of analogy, but I think it was also the necessity of the Cold War. I would also recommend to the students a book I've mentioned before. It's called Bomb Power by Gary Wills. Excellent look at the expansion of executive power with the advent of nuclear weapons. And I think that was probably one of Eisenhower's concerns. It was we were in basically an arms race with people that we thought might use those. So I'm not absolving him of all guilt of creating this thing, but I think the other thing is too is like it becomes a perpetuating kind of idea of lawmakers bringing money back to their districts to have bases, to have funding, to have research at public universities. And so that becomes I want to say a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's not the right way to describe it, but it's like it becomes a circular type of thing that's hard for them to break.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in terms of the idea of the military industrial complex, political scientists, began really thinking about the rise of what we consider like modern interest groups. And it comes out of this post-World War II, post-New Deal era where the federal government, there's a lot more to be had there if you can go there and lobby. And this idea of that now there are groups operating at the local level within the congressional districts, like Chris just said, and the idea of creating standing army or a standing navy or just having the militarization of society isn't as much sometimes about whether it's for the common good, it's the way to make a buck, right? And I think that Eisenhower, in addition to what Professor Fields was just saying about looking outward, I think he's looking inward and he's kind of saying, we need to be careful. There are really powerful interests domestically that are at play right now, and not every foreign policy decision is being made based on whether it's good for the country. It's being made on whether it's good for someone to be making these weapons, and then whether it's good for the Congress people to have those weapons manufacturers in their district. So that's the other part of it that's going on.
Well, is there a threat to democratic principles, to democratic government by this military-industrial complex?
Well, I think actually it's interesting to me, some of the anti-ROTC stuff strikes me as very similar to anti-Federalist arguments, because they said standing army is a threat to liberty. So, and some of the anti-ROTC sentiment on campuses in the 60s seem to be articulating that in various appropriate and inappropriate ways. Wisconsin has this awful event that addresses the issue of the industrial complex on campus doing research for the military. So, David, is that too ham-handed to see the anti-ROTC sentiment on campuses as being a deeply rooted tradition, whether the campus radicals thought that deeply about it?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, Tim, and I'm not 100% sure that I really have a good answer to it, but I think maybe I have another kind of answer, and that is that maybe it's not, and I don't know whether it is or is not a threat to democracy, but I think it's definitely maybe a threat to the Commonwealth broadly defined. And I think about Eisenhower as really the military commander who led the military expedition across the United States in the 1930s to draw attention to just how atrocious American infrastructure was. And I can't remember, but I think it took him about 60 days to get from Washington, D.C. all the way out to California. And they did that on purpose to highlight just the deplorable state of American infrastructure, how far we were behind, and what we were capable of. And so I think of Eisenhower as someone who has a real sense of what is possible in the United States, what is needed in terms of investment and what is possible, and worried that a lot of this productive capacity could be siphoned off into non-productive uses, that could involve the United States in costly struggles abroad. But even if it doesn't, what good are having thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons that take millions and millions of dollars to build and maintain? Surely there is many other productive uses for this money. Now, of course, his New Look policy was part of the creation of that situation, of trying to actually cut defense spending by over-investing in nuclear weapons. But nevertheless, perhaps because he had a front row seat in watching this situation evolve, he had some perspective on it. I know when I teach U.S. East Asian relations, I always have my students read The Ugly American. It's just a wonderful book to teach. And after we finish it, always there's a student that says, if only American policymakers had actually read this book, then we wouldn't have been involved in Vietnam. And that's when I show them the full page ad that JFK took out in the New York Times, saying that he had bought a copy of this book for every member of the U.S. Senate in hopes that they would read it. So no one was aware of the pitfalls of what could happen as much as JFK was, and yet he did it anyway.
Well, I'm wondering, and I don't want to answer my own question, but when I look at the
Since when has that ever stopped you, Dave?
Yeah. But when I look at the term complex, isn't that just another term of faction? Because what we're talking about here is this what I'll call unholy alliance of generals acting as corporate executives, politicians masquerading as admirals in many ways, and corporate executives acting as politicians. And isn't that what he's warning about, is that this complex is going to become such a large, powerful faction that to stand against it, because they also create a messaging system, which Eisenhower talks about not in his farewell address, but in an earlier speech in 1953. He mentions, he understands the times they're in, but we got to be careful about how we arrange this Cold War, society that is developing there. So isn't complex just another word for faction, and therefore that's the essence of the danger of this, Professor Williams?
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking around those terms, but I think for the students, that's a wonderful way to think about the role of factions. I was thinking about it a little differently, just in terms of, to harken back what David said a minute ago. I mean, in 1950s, are we in the midst of robust empire making, or what is this military industrial complex about? I mean, in South Africa, students take a class, they don't call it American foreign policy, they call it American empire building, right? It's a different perspective to see our history. And then I would just have the students think to themselves, I mean, how many democratic empires have existed, and do democratic empires exist, right? So to your question of, is it a threat? I think one way to think about that is through the faction. Another way is something much bigger, just in terms of, what is this complex actually creating? Can it be controlled by the very elites that are supposed to be controlling it? And does that sort of, at some point, is it going to extinguish sort of the liberty that the country was created to protect? I don't have an answer, but I think those are the questions.
Didn't some of the anti-imperialist league use that kind of rhetoric? That's to David Fields. It seems to me that their reaction sounded a lot like what Mike just said. It's what we're doing with our empire building, as they saw it, was anti-democratic, anti-American.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, they feared that, what you do abroad, sooner or later you do at home, and so that's why, for example, a lot of the anti-imperialist magazines put images of Filipino insurgents being waterboarded, things that were absolutely shocking to Americans at the time, and things that we amazingly completely forgot over the next 100 years. And when these issues come up in Iraq, there's a lot of people who aren't historians who can't believe that this has happened, and that the United States has never engaged in this before, when in fact we had, and it was terribly controversial then. And that's why the anti-imperialists brought it up, because they knew that this would be something that would strike right at the heart of what many Americans believed to be true about themselves, and was a very strong argument to answer, there's a very strong argument in favor of their anti-imperialist cause. So yeah, I think so.
Chris,
I just want to go back, because I think that, I'm just thinking of like Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, right? And you couple that with something like Josiah Strong's Our Country, which, my goodness, if you want to read something, kids, that will make your head spin, read what he talks about, the great Anglo-Saxon race spilling over into all these other countries, because he's pulling in the Herbert Spencer social Darwinism into it. It'll make your head spin. I remember I had an exchange student from Mexico in class one time when we were reading, and she was not too happy to hear Mr. Strong. But so I'm thinking, that we kind of went through this prior, which caused the anti-imperialism backlash. When we think about the military-industrial complex, Mahan's book, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, let's build a fleet. Let's join the race for empire. And then you've got the cultural aspect of Strong saying, well, we're clearly the dominant, Anglo-Saxon folks, we're the dominant spokes, and we should go out and do this because it's kind of our duty. So you have the military and the cultural aspects of it. So we've kind of been there, done that. And I think that the threat is just different now in the late 40s and into the 50s with Eisenhower. The threat is much more at least perceived to be at our doorstep in terms of nuclear annihilation.
But I think David Fields, isn't there more a generous interpretation of Mahan, that he's not to put Mahan in the military industrial complex is a little it's not a nice fit, or am I wrong on that?
Well, I wouldn't, I feel like it's apples and oranges, but I feel like with the term empire, actually, I really believe that Mahan, and I think it's pretty clear, Mahan imagined what he was suggesting was actually an alternative to empire. And what he was arguing is the United States actually does not need an empire to be able to compete with European empires. And what he was suggesting was an alternative approach where the United States would be able to project power with just a few coaling stations around the world, and that we could actually just use a navy to accomplish what the British were accomplishing by controlling millions and millions of people and millions of square miles of territory. I think Mahan would have argued that that was unsustainable in American political culture, but he had come up with an alternative approach. And so Mahan was actually very much opposed to the occupation of the Philippines. And in his view, when the United States won that war, all they needed was a base at Subic Bay, and the rest of the Philippines could, you know, happen whatever happened. Now, I think even he grudgingly admitted when the war was over that if the United States vacated, then it was probably going to be the Japanese or the Germans that were going to come in there and fill that space. So I think his writings very much, you know, lent themselves to the creation of an American empire, but very much in spite of himself. I think he saw his writings as actually promoting a unique American response to power projection in which the United States would be able to compete with European empires without having a formal empire itself, without the need to directly administer large swaths of territory or large populations. And just one more thing to add about the anti-imperialist movement in the United States. I feel like it's languished in some obscurity simply because of how racist it was. And a big drive against empire was they did not want the United States Anglo-Saxon stock being diluted by non-white peoples from around the world. And they understood that, you know, if the United States colonizes the Philippines, sooner or later, Philippines are going to be coming back to the United States, either as citizens or as residents. I mean, this is the kind of relationship that exists between empires and metropole. And I think we're so uncomfortable with that I think more often than not, we're happy to paint the 20th century as one of a rise of the American empire, and not mention that actually the rise of American empire was heavily contested. But we're uncomfortable with that because most people, and I feel like most academics, are opposed to the notion of an American empire. And it's somewhat embarrassing to point out that the proponents, or the strongest opponents to American empire in the early 20th century were racists. You know, these are not the kind of people that you really want to be championing. But nevertheless, that's who was leading the fray. And there was other people besides racists in that group, but a lot of them they were very strongly racist.
Well, that is a fascinating insight on. I've never thought about Mahan in that way, and obviously very few people listen to him because we get the birth and explosion. Explosion might be overuse or hyperbole there of the American empire. You know, following the Spanish-American War, and you know, and I've been doing a gut check on myself because when I taught, I used to kind of teach a foreign policy like an ebb and flow between these interventionist, non-interventionist, or isolationist moments there, and you know, i.e., we get post-Spanish-American War, then the 1920s. Militarily, we're trying to lower the temperature. You know, yeah, we're still involved. The Washington Naval Conference, Kellogg-Briand agreement. You know, but we're trying to lower the temperature, but also commercially trade. And then you know, the 1930s with the Nye Committee and the Neutrality Acts. You know, again, more of non-interventionists. And I am wondering, you know, so in each one there seems to be like this perspective of we're going to learn the lesson from the previous phase, i.e., you know, one of the things about the Nye Committee is they're going back, what got us into World War I, as the clouds of World War II are beginning to brew. All right, well, here it is, and so we get the Neutrality Acts. And then post-World War II, we look back and go, okay, what sucked us in and what was the problem of pre-World War II? It was this isolationism, this failure to intervene earlier and to get involved. But I am wondering, did we overreact? I mean, it is partly what Eisenhower is afraid of is that we're overreacting. All right, based upon that pre-World War II experience with Germany and Japan, we're overreacting in post-World War II, and that there are nefarious forces out there who are going to take advantage of that, to create this complex. So I'm just wondering what the rest of you feel. Do you feel that America's foreign policy after World War II was an overreaction to the lessons of pre-World War II?
Professor Fields?
I think it's quite possible. I've never really thought of the speech in that way, and that doesn't mean that it's not. I've always thought of this speech as almost well, maybe it was in the sense that I see this speech as kind of a call for a return to confidence and maybe a return for calmness. And part of this speech, he says, we cannot let the dictates of today consume us to the point that we're spending all of the resources and all of the capital of future generations. And when I read that, I kind of think of someone like Eisenhower saying, let's take a breath here, and let's see where we're at. Let's be calm. Let's try to maybe return to normalcy as much as possible. So in that sense, maybe I can see an overreaction. Another thing that I like to point out about World War II, and this critique really didn't appear after the war, but it was common before the war, and that was that neither Germany nor Japan were really a long-term threat to the United States national security interest, as in a threat to the continental United States. The reason that Japan attacked the United States was because we made clear that we were going to try to do everything we could to thwart them in their 10-year effort to conquer China. And it was really the Japanese incursions in China and Southeast Asia that led to the embargoes against Japan that really caused them to roll the dice and say, I think we can defeat the US Navy and in one fell swoop and then negotiate to consolidate our position in the Pacific. And I feel like if you watch too many History Channel documentaries, you get the idea that Hitler and Hirohito had a 10-year plan for conquering the continental United States, which was not the case at all. The United States easily, if it would have been an isolationist power, and there were actually people who suggested this, said, if you don't want to go to war with Japan, then don't go to war with Japan. Pull out of the Philippines. Tell the Japanese that you're going to be completely neutral in their attempt to conquer China, and the Japanese will not give you another problem. And that absolutely would have been the case, but that was completely untenable from an American political perspective, because the United States had a close, real or imagined relationship with China. And they really believed that Japan was on the wrong side of history when it came to their war with China. And there was no way that they could be seen as not taking a moral stand on that. And I may, sorry, Dave, I may have just taken your question in a completely different way. But that's another reason why I don't necessarily buy the isolationist rhetoric of the 1930s. If we didn't care what happened,
don't worry, David. We do that to David all the time.
Okay, good.
They are pretty bad questions, and so that we have a phrase is cleaning up after the parade, and that's what these guys do for me. Yeah, Chris.
Just quick question. I wonder how much we were financially invested in China. I mean, because obviously we've been butting heads. I mean, did they sink a gunboat on the Yangtze?
The Panay, yeah.
Yeah, and so I knew that we've been butting heads in China prior. So, I mean, not just politically untenable, but what was the business interest in China for us to be able to say, well, you know what, you guys go ahead and take it?
It was paltry. It was nothing. We were way, way more heavily invested in Japan.
Okay.
And so I give a lecture where I talk about 3 reports that were written by American policymakers in the 1930s on the Pacific War. And one of them, and I can't remember the gentleman's name who wrote it, but it's the most obscure of the reports, basically said, if you don't want to go to war with Japan, don't go to war with Japan. And in fact, if we're interested in economics, we trade way more with the Japanese than we do with the Chinese. And actually selling war materials to the Japanese to conquer the Chinese would be much, much more profitable than anything we have going on in China.
So my follow-up then would be, does Roosevelt do this anyway simply to get us involved in Europe?
No, I've never bought that. I've never bought that argument. I don't think that.
What's our interest then to keep painting Japan into a corner with the embargoes on scrap metal and oil and freezing their assets? And so what's in our interest to do that?
I think it comes straight out of the Versailles Treaty and of this belief in international law, and that the international system should be a rules-based order. And even if the United States was not a part of the League of Nations, they're still very much in sympathy with the League of Nations and in that spirit. And they wanted to see international relations conducted along those lines. And there's also heavily a moralistic element to this, that Japanese activity is just immoral, and that in the 20th century, we can no longer tolerate imperial expansion and aggression the way we did in the 19th century. And this is one of the things that makes the Japanese so angry, is from the Japanese perspective, they're just doing what every other power had done in the 19th century. And when someone like the United States says you can't do that, the Japanese are convinced that it's racial. And it's fine when white people do it, but it's not when the Japanese do it.
Thank you. You took the words right out. I mean, you having described the Philippines and our role in the Philippines, you know, the Japanese, who are obviously very much and have in fact tried to mimic in many ways the West. I mean, their jaws have to be dropping by getting lectured by the United States, you know, in this area after, you know, the role of the United States, you know, in the Philippines. So again, for time's sake, the last question talks about international U.S. military presence. And I had to look it up, but we have 800 military bases in 70 countries. So I'm curious to all of you, I hope you comment, but with Professor Fields starting on, do you think this presence, do you think it's altruistic? We're doing it for a rules-based society and democracy. Okay, I think we heard a sneeze there that might have been, or is this just raw self-interest?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, right? I mean, I think the United States benefits tremendously from global stability. Individual Americans do, and I think that's one way of interpreting this massive troop presence that we have around the world. I think another important aspect of this is that almost all of those bases, with very few exceptions, and there are a few exceptions, but almost all of those bases exist with the cooperation of the host government that we sign status of forces agreements with. And when they say that they don't want to do that anymore, we go home, you know, like we did in Iraq, like we will whenever the Koreans get tired of us being there. And that's a really interesting thing about the American base complex around the world. And I think it's an important factor, because I think actually larger than our base network is the fact that we have an alliance system that allows this base network to exist. And so I like to think of American power not in terms of military power alone, but in terms of really a shared value and a shared vision of the world that allows us to negotiate these arrangements with Japan, with South Korea, with Germany, with the Philippines. The Philippines told us to leave and we left, and then they asked us to come back and we came back. You know, I mean, it's really this network of alliances that makes the United States a great power, really a superpower. We could have the same military capabilities that we have right now, and without this network of bases, we would just be an oversized regional power rather than a superpower. And really, this is the difference between us and someone like China, and I think will be the difference for the foreseeable future. China does not enjoy the same network of alliances that we do, because at this point, at least, you know, up to this point, the American vision of what an international system should look like is much more compelling than a Chinese version of what that should look like. Now, I don't think that's going to last forever. It may not last much longer, but I think that is where it stands today. So I don't actually think that it's enlightened self-interest. You know, it's the belief that what's good for the United States is also good for for others, and actually a majority of them seem to agree with that.
Mr. Kavanaugh, I think you sneezed a certain acronym or something.
My allergies are acting up now that the weather's finally broken. So yeah, I just find it. So I don't know if we could prove this. So Professor Fields, what I'm hearing you say is our presence there is actually helping keeping order in the world, which benefits us in the long run. Is that kind of a part of that?
With some notable exceptions, yes.
So what have we done to actually keep peace in parts of the world then? What are we doing in terms of maintaining order to benefit us in that enlightened self-interest?
In East Asia, it's not a secret that most states do not particularly like the Japanese. In fact, if you ask them, they will tell you that they hate the Japanese. The relationship between Korea and Japan is terrible. The relationship between China and Japan is not much better, and they blow off steam regularly in some pretty spectacular ways. And yet they trade with each other as if absolutely nothing was going on, as if they were the best of friends. And why they have these historical grievances there, actually, they don't fear each other. I don't believe that the Koreans are actually afraid of what the Japanese are going to do tomorrow or in the next decade, maybe in the next 3 decades. I think the same is true of the Chinese. And so one way I like to think about the American presence in East Asia is it helps societies that don't like each other trust each other, because they're not afraid of what the Japanese are going to get up to as long as there's 50,000 American troops in Okinawa and 28,000 American troops on the Korean Peninsula. There is a sort of stability that exists there. Now, paradoxically, many scholars have argued that it's this stability that allow these historical enmities to keep rolling over and to keep gaining new life. Yeah. Because they're not afraid of what the Japanese will do. They can poke them in the eye all the time. And so in the long run, that may end up leading, to some pretty undesirable outcomes. But I think it's the same. You can see the same thing in Europe. Look at all the investment that has happened in Europe in the last 75 years. And that investment has happened not just because that, there hasn't been a war in Europe in that period, but also there's a presumption of stability. And what does that presumption of stability rest on? It really rests on an American presence, at the heart of a NATO alliance that is going to keep any disastrous war from breaking out. And in those two regions, I think the United States has really tremendously developed those regions, and it's contributed to their own well-being, and it's contributed to ours. Now, of course, there are some notable exceptions, which is why, the Iraq War will be one of the all-time biggest blunders in American history, because it started to undermine that structure of a rules-based international order that almost a generation of American presidents had done so much work to build and to keep strong. So has the United States been consistent in this regard? Absolutely not. But this is where we start talking about a democracy, right? And in a democracy, you have to be responsive to different political views. And sometimes really bad ideas will come up, and before those people can be voted out of office, they will actually enact their policies.
Well, so like a policy of, putting the Shah in power, like a policy of allowing the Ba'ath Party to come to power in Iraq, the policies that we've enacted through the CIA to sponsor coups around the world to put people in power that we want. So we can't talk democracy on one side and then talk about, what we've done in our own self-interest in terms of subversive movements to put people in power, or where we jumped in bed with people that have a human rights policy that was terrible, but they were anti-communist, so we're going to support these people. And then we turn around years later. How much money did we funnel to Saddam Hussein to fight the Iranians for us in that 8-year war? So I don't know. I just think it's we pull a lot of strings covertly and overtly.
I will absolutely not defend any of those policies. I think they were absolutely bad policies. I think they were also a flip, the opposite side of the same coin, and that we believe that we were in the long term subsidizing interests that would lead to greater stability and lead to a better international system. I think it turned out to be wrong in most of those cases, but nevertheless, I think that's the direction that they were going down.
So I'm going to postulate here, Dr. Williams, I want to bring you in, that Chris and I are on the same side. And and Professor Fields is doing an excellent job of being an academic and relying on facts for his position. But that doesn't hold a lot of weight in this group. But I'm curious, you're an international relations individual, Mr. Williams. Where do you come down on this? And I kind of do want you and Professor Fields to maybe dialogue a little bit, because yours is South Africa, Professor Fields is Korea, and I'm just wondering from your studies, the view of the United States by both countries. And I don't know if I want to phrase that historically or more contemporarily there. So, first off, Mike, how do you feel? Do you think American participation in the world post World War II is predominantly altruistic or predominantly self-interest? And then secondly, what's South Africa's view of the United States in a more contemporary sense, I guess?
Okay, I'll answer those two. I wanted to answer one other thing as well, but yeah, I see, especially looking at sub-Saharan Africa, probably a little more self-interest than altruistic since World War II in terms of American foreign policy interests there. What I do think is interesting is the role that American foreign policy or American presence can play for state development within regions. And there we see very different things happening in East Asia than in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to share like the two things I know about East Asian development, and then Professor Fields, you can correct me. But the fact, in 1957, when Ghana became independent, they had a per capita GDP that was higher than South Korea's, right? And since then, South Korea has took off in terms of economically building up their state structures and eventually a transition to democracy. And the little bit I know about that region is a big factor was that the United States military was there to allow the South Korean state to do a lot of things to develop that they wouldn't maybe otherwise could do if they had to build up their standing army and spend a lot GDP on making war. Sub-Saharan Africa from the 1950s and 60s onward is a very different outcome, whether you have American presence or whether you don't see those same dynamics. So I think it's hard to paint a broad brush because I think different regions have different historical sort of attributes that allow for them to take advantage of the American presence or not. So that would be what I say on that. And then finally with South Africa, I would say it's a complicated view of America right now. Definitely the fact that the United States took so long to support the anti-apartheid forces. Still, a lot of South Africans remember that. And to be honest, right now, when you go to South Africa, you see China's attempt to make a statement there much more than you see with the United States. And it's not through the military bases, and Professor Fields is exactly right. In the long term, it might not be as sustaining, but yeah, it's giving lots of monies for lots of infrastructure projects, which South Africans badly need. And so I would say their view is a bit ambivalent. They would probably consider the Chinese providing more benefit to them right now financially. Yeah, but I hope I got all those questions there.
And you said you had another one
well, the one was just thinking about how South Korea takes off and the role of American presence there. I don't know if I have my political history right on that, David, or not, but that's the way I learned it.
Professor Fields?
I will just add that I would never describe American policy as altruistic. I don't think that's the case. I think rather the way I described it is the United States has a certain vision of how the international system should work. And that is predominantly a rules-based international order where there's more and less equality between sovereign states and where behavior is regulated through an international consensus.
David, can I just, for one, I want to, I read, I think, 50 speeches today on, from 1899 to the present. I agree with you, but the rhetoric that American leaders use, all right, in foreign policy is clearly altruistic, consistently altruistic. All right, you may have a little blip there with the Kissinger years and realpolitik or something, and maybe the Reagan years, and the support of dictatorships and stuff like that, and being somewhat blatant about it. But wouldn't you agree that at least rhetorically we sell everything within a package of being pro-democracy, human rights, and things like that?
Absolutely. I would also say that there's a big difference between the way foreign policy is sold and the way it's actually conducted. So yeah, I would completely agree with that. But I don't think in practice it's actually altruistic. I think in practice it's about a vision of the world that American policymakers and a lot of American people think will benefit the United States, but it will actually benefit everyone else as well. I think predictability in the international system is something, it will provide stability that you can actually build on, that you can actually invest in the future that will lessen the likelihood of conflict.
What I hear is Woodrow Wilson had it right.
I think he did have it right, and I think everybody agreed that he had it right. I think everybody wanted the League of Nations. Everybody wanted to put in place some sort of safeguards that would prevent another terrible war from happening. Yeah. The question is, under what terms would the United States agree to be part of such a league? And they could never get that right. And that's the astounding thing about the League of Nations. It's not defeated because it's unpopular. It's defeated because all the people who support it cannot compromise under what condition the United States will join.
Well, unfortunately, and I got to say, time flew by in such a way, more than any other session here. And so, Professor Fields, we have kind of created a tradition looking at the questions the kids have to deal with here, and I think it's about 3 weeks. I like to go around, to the group and ask them to make some kind of recommendation or some kind of, encouragement to the students here. And I'll let you, have a moment to think about it. So, Mr. Moore, if you were advising students on this question, what's the one takeaway you'd like them to have?
Well, obviously, go back to those Brutus essays and Publius essays. But also, I wonder whether it would be worth, I think it might be worth students' time to consider, has our growth of our military industrial complex been the cause in whole or in part for other nations in their military industrial complex growth? Now, we obviously spend a lot more, but is there a connection between our growth and them spawning growth around the world? I don't know the answer to that, but I think it might be worth students' time to look into that.
Professor Williams?
Yeah, I would have the students, to go back to your point, David, to really think about this military industrial complex as a faction. I think that's a really interesting argument to develop. And then also this question itself, it lends itself to this very broad historical gaze. Like, what did the founders think about a standing army? What do you think about international US military abroad, right? It's the two, those are the two extremes, I think, of thinking about the militarization of our society and our politics. And I think that it would probably be wise for you somewhere to kind of have an argument about that thread. What has changed in American political culture? What has changed with our institutions or our elites, where we're so far from the discussions? Like, just to remind you, we are still having discussions about federalism, as Tim reminded us. Like, there's some discussions that we had at the founding that we continue today. This question has you thinking about, why aren't we having the same questions we had at the founding? We're not talking about this at all as a standing army. And I'd have you think about what happened in Washington, D.C. with President Trump and the use of maybe not a standing army, but the use of National Guard in the district, right? To thinking about these discussions we have about all these bases all over the world. It's a totally different kind of question that allows you to show off your history, I think, in a different way.
Mr. Kavanaugh.
Well, I would tell the students that if you think about the military-industrial complex as a faction, how powerful they are. They killed JFK, so That's a joke. That's a joke, kids. That's a joke.
Well, it's a half joke. Come on, it's a half joke.
I'm just trying to figure out a way to work that in. So, but actually, Michael, what you said actually triggered something in my foggy brain. I said, I think we are having that debate today, federalism issue, because I always go, that last paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, free and independent states. As free and independent states, what do we have the power to do? Levy war, conclude peace, right? So we've got we got our state militias, which you like. And so we've heard this discussion this evening about, people were concerned now because now we're going to have a national army. Is it going to supplant the militia? What is the role of the national government vis-a-vis the militia or state militia? Fast forward, think about nations today like the states then. Right. And Tim's question, has our investment in our military caused other nations to invest or not invest? Actually, I think we've heard that tonight too, that we are, by us picking up that bill, so to speak, other people have been able to perhaps, make gains other places. But if you think about the nations of the world as states coming together under a new constitution, having this argument, I don't know where I'm going with this, but I think there's a link there somewhere. I mean, the view from outer space is like, there are no lines, there are no flags. So why do we all have to have these armies?
David?
Oh, I think first of all, I should probably apologize to the students because I think I've been all over the place in my comments, and I'm worried I've given them very little that they can actually construct an answer around. I doubt the USS Panay is going to be showing up in any of their answers. Alfred Thayer Mahan or Sigmund Rhee. But what I would say is I think a really interesting approach would be to say that, yeah, obviously not all of the founders' concerns about a standing army are still relevant. I mean, in one sense, that ship has sailed. I mean, we have a standing army now. It's really impossible to think.
Halfway around the world.
Yeah, exactly. It's impossible to think of other alternatives. But, one of their main preoccupations was cost. And that's still a very, very relevant concern today. They were afraid of this because it would be so expensive that it would siphon resources that could be better invested in our Commonwealth. And I think that dovetails nicely into the second bullet point. To what extent should there be an international U.S. military presence abroad? And I feel like in a democracy, that answer should be to the extent that it promotes the Commonwealth of the United States. And that's where the debate should be. I don't particularly think that the debate should be, should there be an international military presence, American military presence abroad or not? But are the costs of having that military presence, are they worth the benefits that we get from them? And that's a question that frankly you're not going to find an answer to in any of the founding documents, and that's why the Constitution and the founders were just trying to set up a framework in which we could have these discussions. The Constitution is not an exhaustive list of stupid things you can't do, right? I mean, it's a framework for how you have a debate over that. And so in that sense, I feel like the founders were absolutely right to be preoccupied with the cost of a standing army. And it's something that we should always be thinking about ourselves. It's a debate that we should always be having. Is it worth it? What else could we put this money into? And would that be better for the Commonwealth of the United States?
And I would like to, to echo that. It just, we spend as much as our military on our military as the next 10 countries. And so students, there's a tendency sometimes in We the People to become cheerleaders of the United States and an expression of American exceptionalism. This opening quote and this question allows, I think, some really critical analysis of what the United States has become. And, I'm not going to be shy. I think we're the most militaristic country in the world. If we look at how much we spend and if we look at how many wars we've been involved with, not only your lifetime, but in my lifetime. But don't hesitate to take a critical look at the United States and has it, betrayed some of its founding principles in the field of foreign policy there. So we come to an end of this. Speaking for the other three Bs, I'd like to say we are hoping to find some way to stay here on the air. I don't know if you call it the air or whatever. I do believe if it's possible and we're all alive come next August, that we will be dealing with next year's state questions and national questions. In the interim, we're going to talk about what we want to do, and hopefully we'll see you soon. So good luck at the national finals. It might be that you could see one or two of us there, but if not, just enjoy the journey. So for the 4Bs, peace, love, yogurt, tacos. Hopefully we'll see you sometime in the future. Bye, 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 bonds.